And Zombie Reddit, today's story is...
My parents humiliated me for prioritizing my career over marriage, but 3 years later they lost everything when my 80-year-old grandfather decided to take sides. I am 28 years old and have been in a relationship with my boyfriend Orson, who is 29, for about 4 years. For the last year and a half we have been in a long-distance relationship because I had to move to another city for an important work project. Despite the distance, our relationship is still strong, and we have plans to get married eventually. However, for now we are both focused on our professional careers. Marriage is something we have already discussed, but we don't consider it urgent. For us, it's perfectly fine to wait a little longer. What I can't understand is why my parents have such a big problem with our decision. In recent months, every time I contacted them or visited them, they inevitably brought up the subject of my wedding. They kept telling me that it was time to get married because I've been with Orson for 4 years and I'm nearing 30. According to their reasoning, if I want to settle down, start a family and all that, now is the right time and there's no reason to keep putting it off. I have tried to explain to them numerous times that our priority right now is work. I can't return home until my project is finished, which will take another 6 to 9 months. Once it's over, I'll come back and, of course, Orson and I will talk about our future and probably get engaged. After that, we'll need a few more months to plan the wedding. But we have no problem going at our own pace. For us, marriage is not an urgency, but simply a formality that we will eventually address, and that's it. We know we love each other. We don't need a marriage certificate to prove it to anyone, and I don't understand why my parents can't understand this. They made a fuss every time we talked about it, and I was getting tired of it, so I started calling them less often and keeping some distance. Last week, I called them to congratulate them on their 30th wedding anniversary and to confirm that I would be attending their celebration at the weekend. Again, they brought up the subject of my marriage and went so far as to suggest that I seriously consider giving up my job. I felt they had crossed a line, so I told them straight that that was why I had reduced my communication with them. We ended up in a heated argument. To top it off, they told me not to bother attending any family events until I had a ring on my finger, because it was already embarrassing for them. They were fed up with having to explain to everyone that we were still just dating and weren't even engaged. Their words hurt me deeply, but before I could respond, they simply hung up. After that conversation, I called Orson and ended up crying for a long time because they had really hurt me. He comforted me, and eventually I felt better. Even so, I decided to go to my city that weekend as I had originally planned because I wanted to see Orson. On the day of the celebration, I was at home in the afternoon. A few hours after the party had started, my grandfather called me to ask why I hadn't arrived yet, as I am usually punctual, especially at events organized by my parents. So I had to tell him the truth. My grandfather, who is my dad's father, and I have a very close relationship, so he was worried about me, plus we hadn't seen each other for a while. After listening to my whole story, he simply said, "I see," and mentioned that he would call me after the party. Later I found out everything that happened at my parents' celebration. Shortly after talking to me on the phone, my grandfather decided to give a speech at the party. However, he did not talk about my parents, but instead started talking about me. Specifically, he addressed how my parents had been pressuring me to get married. He described it as if my parents had received some kind of payment from my boyfriend's family, and I was obliged to get married to pay off that debt. When guests would ask about me, my parents would simply say that I was delayed. That was their excuse for my absence. But then my grandfather revealed the truth to everyone present, leaving my parents in a very uncomfortable position when it became known what had really happened. The attendees began to look at them disapprovingly as my grandfather continued to speak. And to top it all off, he concluded his speech by pointing out that my parents had called me an embarrassment simply because I was not married at 28, all because they felt judged by some nosy relatives who had nothing better to do than criticize the lives of others. In contrast, he said he was prouder of me than he had ever been of my father. He emphasized that at least I had managed to become independent and did not need my father's help to find a job. My grandfather called my parents stupid and said they would be nothing if their own parents had not supported them because, unlike me, they had never focused on their work. According to him, they were always too busy trying to impress others, and that is why, for years, they depended on their parents to support them raise their children, and even buy their house. He told them that, in reality, they should be ashamed of themselves and not of me. After this, he left, followed by several guests who also left the party. My parents called me immediately to reprimand me. This happened a couple of days ago, and they are extremely upset with me because, according to them, I know how temperamental my grandfather is and could have come up with some excuse to prevent him from reacting like that during the party. However, I decided to play the victim, provoking my grandfather's reaction. This not only changed the atmosphere of the celebration, but also caused many guests to leave. In addition to these unreasonable arguments, they also want me to convince my grandfather to offer a formal apology to all those present, as many people left quickly after the speech, without giving them the opportunity to explain their side of the story or to try to calm the situation. At this point, I don't feel guilty at all, because I was always taught that the truth is the most important thing, and I simply told the truth. If my parents have a problem with that, maybe the problem really is with them. And I'm not going to try to convince my grandfather to apologize. If he thinks he did nothing wrong, which I believe is his position, and he wants to keep his words, that's his decision. I'm not going to tell a grown man what to do, especially after everything he's done for my parents. He has every right to express his opinion at the party and leave whenever he wants. And if the guests had lifted him up in the air, cheering his name, so much the better. That's my current situation with my parents. Edit. I thought my grandfather's speech clarified many aspects, but I see that they need more context. Basically, my parents got married very young, around the age of 24. At the time, they were just starting their professional careers and depended heavily on their parents for almost everything. When they had me, they were experiencing financial difficulties because they didn't know how to manage their money well. Therefore, their parents had to lend them money repeatedly. After I was born, they became even more dependent on their parents, with the additional responsibilities of raising a baby, and from what I have heard, they did so without showing any remorse. Obviously, I have never mentioned this directly to my parents because I know it is a sensitive issue for them. My father has now achieved some success in life, but it took him many years and a lot of help from my grandfather. My grandfather allowed my father to take control of his company just a few years ago, but only after he proved himself competent enough to run it. It's not a big company. It only has a few employees, but it was a huge act of trust on my grandfather's part to hand over something so important to him. Personally, I'm not interested in that kind of work, and I have to admit that everything my grandfather said about my independence is completely true. Since graduating from university, I have received very little financial support from my parents, and I have never asked for it. I am proud of that, and I am definitely proud of not following their example. Naturally, I have never held this against them because I don't want to be that kind of person, but I am glad that my grandfather expressed what he thought. I don't understand why I should feel bad about it. It's not like he was lying. My parents tried to make me feel guilty for prioritizing my career over marriage. It's true that they care too much about what other people think of them, which is strange, considering that they should be more concerned with my well-being than with the opinions of others. In any case, some issues are quite private, and my grandfather decided to expose them. Basically, that's the reason for my parents' current anger. Update 1. I'm back at work. I was only home over the weekend. And of course I've been in touch with my granddad since the party. I didn't mention it in my original post. I forgot, but I did talk to him about what happened, the speech he gave and all that. As I expected, he doesn't regret anything. He was very direct and firm about it. He told me that, after talking to me during the party, he was outraged. He couldn't believe that my parents had said something like that to me, especially coming from them. Although my grandfather is not usually impulsive, he pointed out that my parents had several days to apologize if they had spoken without thinking, but they didn't. That shows that they really meant what they said. It's not as if they didn't have a chance to rectify. They still had a couple of days before the party to contact me, resolve the misunderstanding, apologize or retract. But they chose not to because, for them, the opinion of relatives I had barely seen a couple of times in my life about my marriage was more important than my own wishes. My grandfather found that simply disgusting and pathetic. When I told him that, after he left, my parents called me to complain and blame me for everything. He advised me not to worry about their opinions, as they only think of themselves. And my grandfather doesn't regret anything he said either. His only regret is not having had more time to prepare a better speech. But I assured him that his intervention was quite effective, as my parents' reaction was invaluable. With regard to my parents, I have decided to cut off all communication with them. I will not speak to them until they at least offer me a sincere apology. Until that moment, I have blocked them and will not respond to any of their messages or calls. I am doing this for my own peace of mind. Update 2. For the sake of time reference, it has been 2 weeks since my last communication with my parents. During all that time, I haven't even checked their messages. Today I had a quiet day at work, and out of curiosity, I finally decided to read them. Most of them said the same thing, that they were disappointed in me, that they never expected me to behave this way. They listed all the reasons why I am a bad daughter and similar things. At this point, it no longer affects me, especially after my conversation with my grandfather. So I didn't give it any more thought and went back to concentrating on my work. By an extraordinary coincidence, today was also the day my parents decided to contact Orson. I don't understand why they felt the need to do so, because until now, apart from comforting me, he hadn't been involved in the situation at all. I don't think he was too bothered about missing my parents' anniversary celebration anyway, considering that we hadn't been in the same city for a long time. They called him and started trying to make him feel guilty, telling him that they had always treated him like a son, that they had accepted him into the family without question, and that they had always been kind to him. Based on all that, they claimed that now, as his future son-in-law, it was his responsibility to talk some sense into me and convince me to respond to their messages. They told him he owed them that favor. Orson is a rather reserved person and prefers to avoid conflict, so he didn't tell them much. He simply listened to them, and before ending the call, he mentioned that he would talk to me. And indeed he did, but not with the intention of pressuring me or creating more tension, but only to inform me of what had happened. However, from his tone of voice, I could tell that he was really offended by the way my parents spoke to him. I know exactly what he must have been experiencing. I know they didn't directly insult him or shout at him, but they have a particular way of communicating, that irritating, condescending tone with which they talk to people from a position of superiority. I know it well because I have experienced it all my life. I was deeply outraged that they decided to involve Orson in this matter because he had no relation to the problem. This situation was between my family and me. And yes, Orson is my family, but in a completely different sense. Although for my parents he is not, so I don't understand why they involved him when, according to them, there was no ring on my finger. More importantly, it is absurd that they think he can influence my decisions. He is not my boss. Just as I am not my grandfather's boss, we cannot force each other to do things. Why do they find it so difficult to understand that concept? I was already a bit irritated after reading their messages, and when this happened, my frustration increased considerably. So I decided to give them exactly what they wanted. I called them to talk to them and clarify things once and for all. As soon as I dialed the number, they answered immediately. It was as if they were sitting by the phone, with their finger ready to press the answer button as soon as the call came in. But I was ready too, so I took the initiative in the conversation. I made it absolutely clear to them that they had no right to involve Orson in this matter. I explained that this was a problem between us, and I would appreciate it if they would behave with dignity and keep it that way. I also confronted them for talking to Orson as if he owed them some favor, because he owes them absolutely nothing. They haven't done anything extraordinary for him. They have simply been polite, as they would be to any guest or acquaintance. That is basic courtesy. It doesn't mean they have done him any special favors, nor have they truly accepted him into our family in any meaningful way, and this business of him being their future son-in-law had to stop. I told them that they really needed to take a step back, and that it was absurd that, after everything that had happened, they still hadn't learned their lesson. That they should stop obsessing about my wedding, my love life, and everything related to it, and just leave me alone. Immediately, they started arguing. For them, my supposed lack of soul or love towards them was reflected in my behavior. They insisted that I was behaving terribly towards them and that they never expected this kind of behavior from me. But I simply repeated what my grandfather had told me, that if they had no problem hurting me by telling me that I shouldn't attend family events unless I was engaged, and if they didn't care how that affected me, then I wouldn't worry if my words or actions hurt them either. They tried another tactic, But like all their strategies, it was about manipulating me. However, I already know all their methods. It is not my first confrontation with them. Although this situation is evolving into a bigger family conflict with the involvement of my grandfather and other relatives. Some, like my grandfather, take a more confrontational stance, while others simply support me without saying too much. My mother claimed that all she wanted for me were good intentions. She wanted to see me married, with a baby and all the good things that marriage supposedly brings. That she was just trying to give me that push so that I would finally take the step towards the wedding. She was obviously exaggerating, deliberately trying to make me feel guilty, but I didn't fall into her trap. I replied that if she really wanted what was best for me, she would have respected my position instead of constantly trying to pressure me. But that was exactly what she and my father had been doing all along. I told them that I am not part of a herd of sheep, and that was the real problem, wasn't it? They just wanted me to follow their orders, like when I was a child. That I didn't question anything, that I didn't form my own opinions, that I didn't think for myself. And now that I don't blindly obey them, I've become the villain who is destroying my parents. I reminded them that over the last few months I had explained to them numerous times that I was away for work reasons, that things were already difficult for me, that my job was exhausting, and that leading a team was not exactly easy. I do my best, but even so, at the end of the day, I return to an empty house. I miss home, I miss everyone. It's not like I enjoy being away, but I have to do it because it represents a great professional opportunity. And Orson understands. He is the most important person to me in this whole situation. He respects my decisions. And if he's fine with it, why is it so difficult for them, my own parents, to understand? It's not as if I'm going to marry them. In fact, they should be even more understanding, because they know I'm doing something difficult. Instead, they had the audacity to suggest that I give up my job and come home to get married. And then, had they even considered the implications of that? I told them that I didn't want to end up like them, borrowing money from their parents, not thinking about the future, only worrying about other people's opinions. That's not who I am, and I never want to be like that. And since they couldn't respect that, the best thing they could do was simply stay out of my life. My mother cried inconsolably while saying something about how I am her daughter and she didn't want to hurt me, so my father had to pick up the phone. He told me that what I had said was unforgivable, that I had to retract it, or else they would never speak to me again. I told him that was fine with me, that it was the best offer I'd had in months. And that was the end of it. They hung up the phone and blocked me on all platforms. And honestly, I don't care. There won't be an end to my update here where I say I'll miss them or that I feel bad, because I don't. What I have always wanted is for them to leave me alone, and that is exactly what they have offered, so I am not going to refuse it. Update 3. A couple of days have passed since my parents blocked me on all platforms. The day after they did it, I called my grandfather and told him everything that had happened. He listened to me carefully, and when I finished, he simply told me he was proud of me. If I needed to hear from someone that my actions were correct, that someone was my grandfather. After that conversation, I concentrated on my work and stopped thinking about the matter. However, this morning, my grandfather called me again and told me that last night there was a big drama with my parents. Apparently, they showed up at his house unannounced and started accusing him of having been instigating me all this time. So here we are again. My parents can't convince me to be their faithful servant, so they need to harass other people. First, they try to get me to talk to my grandfather to persuade him to offer a public apology for the speech he gave on their anniversary. But weeks have passed, and I doubt very much that anyone would care about that apology at this point. Besides, my grandfather has already made it very clear that he has no intention of apologizing under any circumstances. That ship has already sailed and is in another port now. All their strategies revolve around manipulation. The only thing that changes is the person at whom they direct their tactics. They tried it with me, and now they're trying it with my grandfather. For example, you only have to observe their behavior. Instead of trying to get me to convince my grandfather to apologize, they are now trying to get him to convince me to apologize to them. So they went to his house, accused him of provoking me, of brainwashing me against him, and of having manipulated me into distancing myself from them. They told him that it was now his responsibility to make things right and to get me to apologize and restore a good relationship with them. When my grandfather told them that he wasn't going to do that, in fact, everything he had told them was true and that maybe they should reflect on their actions, instead of trying to manipulate me, my father lost his temper. He started to shout right in his face. The same father who provided him with a good job, a place where he can earn a good salary without trying too hard. It's not just a mistake, it's a very serious mistake. The situation became so tense that my grandfather really thought my father was going to push him or even physically assault him. It didn't come to that, but only because my mother stopped him at the last moment. Even so, he didn't stop shouting. He just continued to vent his anger against my grandfather, saying horrible things to him. And the most incredible thing is that, even after all that, they still expected my grandfather to help them. After listening to them shout at him for what must have seemed like an eternity, my grandfather finally warned them that if they didn't leave, he would call the police. That finally made them back down and leave. But the whole situation was extremely worrying. After hearing this story, I realized that I needed to warn Orson. If my father had been able to show up at my grandfather's house to initiate a confrontation, who was to say he wouldn't do the same at our house? So I called Orson to alert him, but it turned out it was already too late. My parents had already been to our house. Orson told me that they had shown up at our door the night before. When I asked him the exact time, I realized that they probably went there after my grandfather had kicked them out of his house. But they behaved in a completely different way with him. Unlike how they treated my grandfather, with Orson they were surprisingly kind. Not at all aggressive. He let them in, and they immediately began to apologize for everything they had said to him the last time they spoke. They assured him that they really considered him like a son, and that they were happy that we had been together for so long. More manipulation, just changing the recipient. But, naturally, they couldn't help resorting to the same old excuse that all they had ever wanted was for us to get married, because in their minds, that was what should happen, and it would be the best thing for me. Then, they started complaining that I simply didn't understand that they only wanted the best for me. They told him that I was being obstinate and stubborn. Of course, Orson defended me. But instead of arguing with him, my parents simply nodded and pretended to agree with everything he said. They tried to use the argument of generational difference, claiming that they simply had a different mentality because they belonged to an older generation, which creates a space-time paradox because it seems even more outdated than my grandfather's. Then they started to tell him about the heated argument I had with them the last time we spoke, as if Orson didn't already know the whole story. Obviously, I had already told him everything, so this was nothing new to him. But my parents were trying to reinterpret the situation to present themselves as the victims. They claimed that although they had been harsh with me, what I had said to them had been much worse, that I had not been respectful to them. And once again, they began to hint that they wanted Orson to talk to me and convince me to apologize. And Orson simply avoided committing himself and said nothing concrete. I think after a while, my parents got tired of waiting for him to say what they wanted to hear because they finally gave up. Before leaving, they told him that they would really appreciate his help in getting me to communicate with them and apologize. But of course, he made no promises. He just listened to them. He told me that he intended to call me that same evening to tell me what had happened, but when they left, it was already dinner time, so he got distracted with other activities. In fact, he was about to call me this morning, but I got ahead of him. After analyzing the whole situation, I recommended that the next time my parents tried to contact him, it would be best to ignore them completely. He totally agreed with this suggestion. In fact, he had already considered it. He asked me, with a laugh, who else they would try to recruit to manipulate me. Update 4. Several weeks have passed since my parents showed up at my grandfather's house, and then at mine. After that whole incident, they didn't try to contact my grandfather again, but they did continue trying to get in touch with Orson. Initially, Orson ignored them, just as we had agreed. After that visit I mentioned in my previous update, he stopped letting them in completely. The first few times they showed up, he simply pretended not to be at home. But after the third attempt, he lost patience. When they tried again, he finally confronted them. He told them directly that there was nothing he could do for them because I had already made my decision and I had no regrets. And besides that, he didn't think I had any reason to regret it either. From the way he put it, it was perfectly clear that he wasn't going to intercede on their behalf, or try to convince me to apologize, or do whatever it was they were hoping for. But instead of accepting the reality of the situation, my parents simply showed up again. What Orson didn't tell them was that next time there would be no explanations. He would call the police. And that's exactly what he did. He let them knock for a while without answering, while he contacted the police, and when he confirmed that the authorities were on their way, he went out to entertain them briefly. That conversation was similar to the previous ones, my parents manipulating and Orson reiterating that he would not cooperate with them. Finally, the police arrived and Orson told them that he was tired of dealing with them and that from that moment on, the officers would take care of the situation. He then asked the officers if they required his presence, to which they replied in the negative, explaining that the call had already provided all the necessary information. So he simply turned around, closed the door, and went about his business. My parents were taken to the police station, where they were registered and given a formal warning to stop harassing Orson. This information came to me through my grandfather, who has been following my parents' police case. He also indicated that I could now talk openly about the matter, although I have mentioned it briefly in a previous update. My grandfather has already removed my father from his position in the company and has found a replacement, as he does not wish to take on that responsibility himself. He offered the position to Orson, but he too declined, explaining that he preferred to continue exploring the possibilities offered by his own professional career. Don't think we're missing out on a $1 million opportunity. It's just a family business that has been very profitable for my grandfather, and it was also for my father until recently. But neither of us is particularly attracted to the idea of running a company. Update 5. I'm sharing with you the consequences my parents have faced after losing the company. Frankly, they have not been positive. Now I don't know who they're trying to manipulate because they haven't succeeded with my grandfather. They tried to reason with him, they tried to get him to reinstate my father in his job, but all they got was a threat to call the police when they showed up at his house. They fled before the authorities arrived, knowing that this would be their second offense, and it wouldn't just be a simple warning. I guess it's time to use their manipulation tactics on someone who can offer them a job. In the end, it backfired for my parents to have gotten married at a young age, as this has brought them negative consequences in the long run. Look at their current situation, the same or worse than when they started their married life. Update 6. 3 years have passed since the beginning of this story, and Orson and I have finally got married. My parents only had to wait 3 years to see their wish come true. Unfortunately, however, they had to witness it from a distance, as they were not invited to the ceremony. To be fair, we didn't invite many people either, as it was a rather intimate event. Only my grandfather, some close relatives, and several friends attended. It was a simple and personal celebration. I wonder if my parents felt any sense of shame at not having been invited. I know that my being single was an embarrassment for them, but didn't they also find it humiliating to be excluded from the wedding? In any case, I don't know. I have had no contact with them at all during all this time, not even with my grandfather. All I know is that my father got a job, as my grandfather never gave him back his position in the company. I don't know if it's a good job or not, but judging by how little he's bragged about it on social media, from what I've been told, it can't be something to be proud of. For Orson and for me, at least our professional careers have prospered, which allows us to start this new stage as a married couple, and perhaps in the future, to start a family on a solid economic basis.